Welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. Today, we're going to take a look at 3 tips for new roasters. These tips are going to help a new roaster have a successful roast, but more importantly, understand what's happening during the roasting process when we roast coffee beans. So this can apply to somebody who's roasting on a hot air popcorn popper, or somebody who is roasting on a drum roaster, or anything in between. So let's get to it. Okay, thanks for joining me today. So these 3 tips that I'm about to share correlate directly to the 3 phases of roasting. So when we roast coffee, there is a dry phase, there is a middle phase, or the browning phase, where there's chemical reactions taking place that are going to influence the flavor of the coffee. And then there is the development phase, which happens after first crack. So we're going to be talking about each of these and the 3 tips that relate to each of these stages. So the first stage is the dry stage, and the first tip is this, is that you want your dry stage to be less than half of your total roast time. So let's say you throw beans into a hot air popper and your total roast is going to be 6 minutes. Ideally, you're going to want to have the dry time be 3 minutes or less. That means that by the time you put those beans into the hot air popper or into your drum or whatever it is, you're going to want to have dry end take place halfway through the roast or less. So for me, let's say that my roast is a total of 10 minutes. I like my dry time to be less than 5 minutes. Ideally, I like to have it be even shorter than that, but that's a perfect start. That's a good goal to try to attain. So before we get on to the second tip, let's just talk about some of the problems that can occur with what I just said. So on a hot air popcorn popper, you don't have that much control over how quickly the heat is going to dry your beans. And that's a big challenge for hot air popcorn people. So with a Sonafresco, you have a power adjustment, so you can adjust the heat level on that, and you can kind of address the whole pace of your roast. On a hot air popper, you've got to do some hacks. Either you're going to take this thing apart and then become an electrical engineer, or follow directions on the internet and do some wiring, which there's people that do that, or you're going to do other mods like modify the lid, or put something underneath the hot air popper to reduce the amount of airflow that's coming up into the underside of the hot air popper, which is going to create higher temperatures. So there's a lot of things that you can do, but safety is always a factor, and you need to be very careful. Always be with your roaster while you are roasting, and you just need to pay attention to what's happening. So within this first tip, during this green time, you need to be watching your beans. You need to be looking at the color and smelling and observing the pace of the roast. The second tip is for the middle phase. Try to set the middle phase to be 30% of your total roast time. So by the time you call dry end to when first crack happens, you will try to have it be 1/3 of the total time. So if it's a 10-minute roast, then you're going to have a 3-minute middle phase. So again, this is just a guideline to try to help you try to establish some consistency, and also find and learn what's happening to your roast during the roast process. So, I've got these 3 tips, but what I'm really encouraging you to do is to pay attention to each of the roasting phases so that you can see what's going on. Because you may be having a flat cup of coffee or a kind of bitter cup of coffee. And all of the things that we're talking about can influence those tastes, those experiences with your coffee. So this 1/3 time that I'm talking about with this browning phase begins right after dry end, so after the first, say, 5 minutes, if we're using this 10-minute example or less. And you're going to want to have the pace of the roast slowed down. That means that You may be pushing your roast to try to get dry with a lot of heat. But then after you've reached this dry point, you're going to want to reduce the amount of heat to slow the pace at which this roast is progressing. Here's an example. You're a hot air popper person and you've dried your beans, and now the heat just keeps pouring out, and then the next thing you know, within let's just say it's 4 or 5 minutes to dry, and then all of a sudden your roast is cracking at a minute and a half later. And so that's too short of a time. And so what you're going to find out is that you're missing on a lot of the flavors that the coffee can produce, and you may get a kind of a tart taste in your coffee. You may think, oh, that's a citrus flavor, but in essence, because you have rushed through that middle phase, you are actually creating kind of a tart flavor profile within that coffee. So how do you fix that? How do you address reducing that heat on a hot air popcorn popper? On a drum roaster, we turn the gas down and we maybe increase our airflow a little bit. There's different things that we can do to kind of allow the temperature to keep climbing, but at a slower rate. But on a hot air popper, what can you do? Well, you could take the lid off on the hot air popper. You could if you have a towel or something on the underside of your hot air popper during the dry process, you could remove it so that during this middle phase, you allow a little more cool air to mix in with the drying, the heat coming from the hot air popcorn popper, and that would still continue to have the roast move along, but at a slower rate, okay? The third option is to take the lid completely off, but I'm not sure that that's necessary. So what I mean by the lid is the whole plume of the hot air popper, if that's what you're using, rather than where the hot butter, like where the melting butter tray is on the top of some of the poppers. You can take that off, and that allows that heat to escape a little more, and that'll slow the roast down. But ideally, you're going to have to figure that out yourself. You're going to have to figure a way to slow your roast down so that first crack doesn't happen soon after dry. Okay, the third tip is during development. We want to stretch the development out, and this is where a lot of the body of the coffee takes place. This is where this development, this mouthfeel that you will experience, where also where there's some caramelization, and you'll get some of the longer you go, you'll basically cook off some of the acidic flavors, if that's what you're looking for in your roast profile. And so you're going to want to try to, again, stretch out your roast. How do you do that? By reducing the amount of heat. Now, I'm not saying for you to turn off your hot air popcorn popper, but on a drum roaster or on a Sonafresco, you're, again, dialing down the amount of gas, or even turning the gas off and letting that roast coast. There's a lot of things that are happening inside of your drum or your hot air popper while these beans are roasting. They're touching each other, they're exchanging heat, they're passing heat to each other in so many different ways. Air is moving around them. So you have some ability to reduce that amount of energy, and you have to be creative. So again, with a hot air popcorn popper, maybe it's removing the lid completely. Maybe it is fanning a little bit from the outside, just having a little bit of air movement over the, not down into where it's roasting, but across the top just a little bit, just to help relieve some of that energy that is trapped down inside your hot air popcorn popper. The drum people you're roasting, you can turn up your airflow to turn on the brakes a little bit. You have the benefit of looking at your Artisan or Cropster data logging software, so you can see the progress of your rate of rise going down. Ideally, you want to have your development phase be 20% of your roast time. And again, you can fluctuate that based on what you're looking for in your flavor profile. The further you go past this 20% that I've shared with you, the less coffee characteristics from the bean that you've purchased, that you bought this bean because it has chocolate, it has a fruity note, or it has caramel in it, or whatever that flavor is. The further you go into the roast after that 20%, the hotter that bean gets on the inside, the closer you get to second crack, or if you've hit second crack, the less of that bean characteristic you're going to have. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you guys like what you've seen, please hit the like button. If you would like to see more of my videos, hit the subscribe button. That helps me out a lot. And most importantly, if you want to be notified, hit that bell. And the next time I upload a video, you'll be the first to know. If you have questions, or if you have an opinion and you want to share it, do that in the comments area. And I appreciate you being here today. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next week.